Number 3. Michelle Martinko. In December 1979, Michelle Martinko, who lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, was 18 years old. She was a senior in high school, and she was a member of her school's choir. About 2 weeks before Christmas, the choir recorded some Christmas songs for a local television show. The show was to air on the morning of December 20th, and then it would replay that evening. The night before the show aired, the choir had a banquet at a hotel in Cedar Rapids. After the banquet, Michelle called her parents and told them she was going to the Westdale Mall to buy a new winter coat. The mall had just opened months earlier in October. At around 8 p.m., friends of Michelle saw her at the mall. But sadly, she never arrived home. At 2 a.m., her worried parents called the police and told them that she hadn't come home. 2 hours later, her car was found in the parking lot of the mall. Michelle's dead body was inside the car. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and the face. Her hands were marked with defensive wounds. She was fully clothed, and she had not been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner thought that she had died around 9 o'clock the night before. The television station was unaware that Michelle had been killed, and on the morning that she was found dead, they aired the footage of her and the rest of the choir singing. In the early days of the investigation, the police didn't have much in the way of evidence. It wasn't long before the case went cold. The first significant suspect emerged a year after the murder. On June 16, 1980, 18-year-old Susan Below clocked out of her job in Las Vegas, Nevada. She was reported missing when she didn't come home. A few days later, another young woman was reported missing from Las Vegas. 20-year-old Cheryl Daniels vanished while she was on a date. Her date had run into a store to buy some beer, and when he got back to the car, Cheryl was missing. 6 months later, in December 1980, Cheryl's body was found in the desert near St. George, Utah. She had been sexually assaulted and shot in the head. Near the body, the police found a wallet. Inside the wallet was a credit card that belonged to 30-year-old Stephen Morin. The police also found an address written on a piece of paper in the wallet. The police went to the address and found out that a woman was living there. She was a co-worker of Susan Below, who was still missing. The woman said that Morin had been stalking her. When the police went to arrest Morin, he was gone. It turned out that Morin had fled the state. On November 6, 1981, Morin kidnapped 23-year-old Sheila Warren in Golden, Colorado. He took her to a motel room and he stabbed her to death. A month later, Morin kidnapped 21-year-old Janet Bruce from a hotel in Corpus Christi, Texas. He strangled her to death and dumped her body in a culvert. 8 days later, Morin was trying to steal a car outside of a restaurant in San Antonio, Texas. The owner of the car, 21-year-old Carrie Marie Scott, who was a waitress at the restaurant, came out of the restaurant and found Morin trying to steal it. She confronted him, and he shot her to death. He fled from the scene, and the police tracked him down to a motel. In his motel room, they found a woman he had kidnapped days before, but Morin had slipped out a window, and he was gone. He had gone to a shopping center and kidnapped Margaret Palm. For 10 hours, Morin drove around with Margaret in the vehicle. During those 10 hours, they listened to some audio cassettes that Margaret had that were recordings of an evangelist preacher. She also read from her journal that had Bible quotes in it. Morin then decided to let Margaret go. He traded his bullets for her journal that contained the Bible quotes. Morin went to a bus station, and he boarded a bus heading to Austin. The police were alerted, and they rushed to the bus station. Morin was arrested without incident. He was charged with the murder of Carrie Marie Scott. Morin said that Margaret had converted him to Christianity during the time that he held her captive. Because of his newfound religious faith, he pleaded guilty to capital murder, and he was sentenced to death. He was only the second person to plead guilty to capital murder in the history of Texas. Stephen Morin was also convicted of the murders of Janet Bruce and Sheila Warren. He received a death sentence for both of those convictions. He was never charged with the murders of the two Las Vegas women, Susan Belote and Cheryl Daniels. The police believe that Morin could have committed anywhere between 30 and 50 murders. This included the murder of Michelle Martinko. Morin was a drifter who traveled around the country. He was also heavily addicted to cocaine. The police asked him about other murders he may have committed, but his answers were always vague. Investigators thought he did too many drugs, and he couldn't remember most of the crimes he committed. On death row, Morin led a Bible study group, and he even got a degree in biblical teachings. He refused to appeal his conviction and his death sentence. Just after midnight on December 11, 1985, Morin was brought into the execution chamber in Huntsville, Texas. Because of Morin's history of drug abuse, it took 40 minutes to find a vein that they could insert a needle into. They finally found a vein, and he was pronounced dead at 12:55 a.m. The police in Cedar Pines thought it was possible that Morin killed Michelle Martinko, but they couldn't prove anything. So once again, her case went cold. The police had blood samples that were found on Michelle's coat and the gear shift of her car. In 2006, they had the blood tested and discovered that the blood didn't belong to Michelle. Instead, it belonged to a man. Presumably, during the murder, the killer was injured and he left his blood in the car. In 2018, Parabon Nanolabs did a reverse genealogy search on the DNA. Parabon Nanolabs is a DNA phenotyping company that is responsible for helping identify the Golden State Killer as Joseph James DeAngelo. Parabon Nanolabs narrowed down the suspects, and the police began to follow 64-year-old Jerry Lynn Burns, who lived in the small town of Manchester, Iowa, which is about 50 miles north of Cedar Rapids. He had gone to high school in Manchester, and he had lived there most of his adult life. At the time of Michelle's murder, he was 25 years old. The police were able to pick up an item that he discarded that had his DNA on it. It was compared to the DNA found in Michelle's car, and it was a match. On December 19, 2018, 39 years to the day of Michelle's murder, Jerry Burns was arrested, and he was charged with first-degree murder. At the time of his arrest, Jerry owned a powder coating company in Manchester. He also used to work at John Deere, and he had co-owned a truck stop that was just outside of town. Jerry was well known in Manchester, which has a population of about 5,000 people. Everyone thought he was upbeat and friendly. Jerry has one son and two daughters. His family was completely shocked by his arrest. Jerry didn't have a criminal record. Had he not been found through reverse genealogy, the police would have never had a reason to suspect that he stabbed Michelle to death. If there was a motive for the murder, the police haven't made that public. After Jerry was arrested, people started to look at tragedies in his life in a new light. Jerry married his wife, Patricia, in 1975, 4 years before Michelle's murder. In June 2008, at the age of 55, Patricia died. Her death was ruled a suicide. Jerry was questioned by the police after her death, but the police were confident that it was a suicide. Then on December 19, 2013, 34 years to the day of Michelle's murder, Jerry's cousin, 55-year-old Brian Burns, went missing. Brian was last seen in his home in Manchester. He has never been found. The police said that Jerry is not a suspect in the death of his wife or the disappearance of his cousin. Jerry Burns will most likely go to trial for the murder of Michelle Martinko in 2019. Number 2, Michelle Welch and Jennifer Bastian. In the spring of 1986, Michelle Welch was 12 years old, and she lived with her family in Tacoma, Washington. She was a bright and talented girl who played the piano and the violin. On March 26, 1986, Michelle took her 2 younger sisters to Puget Park, which wasn't far from their home. Not long after noon, Michelle rode her bike home and picked up lunch for her and her sisters. She then rode her bike back to the park. While she was gone, her sisters needed to use the washroom, so they left the park and went to a nearby business. When they returned to the park at about 1 o'clock, they found Michelle's bike and their sandwiches on a table, but Michelle was nowhere to be seen. They looked around the park for her, but they couldn't find her. So they went home and told their mother that they couldn't find her. Her mother called the police. Later that night, Michelle's body was found by a search dog in a gulch not far from the park. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and her throat had been cut. 5 months later, 13-year-old Jennifer Bastian, who also lived in Tacoma, was training for a bike tour. On August 4th, she left her family's home on her bike, and she rode 30 blocks to Point Defiance Park. When she didn't return home later that day, her family alerted the police, and a massive search was launched. Over 3 weeks later, her body was found hidden in a wooded area near a trail that is commonly used by joggers. Her bike was lying a few feet from her body. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The police, and most people who heard about the murders, assumed that they were committed by the same man. Both victims were young girls who were killed after they rode their bike to a park. At first, the police had an array of suspects. One suspect was a man named David Fisher. In 1970, Fisher had sexually assaulted and beat to death 13-year-old Laura Burbank in Tacoma. He was arrested, but the case against him was circumstantial. He ended up pleading guilty to second-degree manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was sent to a minimum security prison to serve his sentence. The prison didn't have any walls or fences. In September 1974, Fisher walked away from the prison, and no one noticed for hours. At the time of Michelle and Jennifer's murders, Fisher was still on the lam, and the police thought it was possible that he was back in the Tacoma area. Another suspect emerged in May 1986, about 2 months after Michelle was killed, and 3 months before Jennifer was murdered. A man named Robert Washburn had called the police and told them that on the day that Michelle was killed, he was in the same park, jogging. He told them as he was jogging, he saw a man who looked like the sketch of the suspect. He said the man was also jogging. The police interviewed Washburn after Jennifer was killed, and he said on the day that she went missing, he just happened to be in that park jogging as well. Since Washburn was in both parks on the days that both girls were killed, the police thought he could have been the killer. But they had no evidence to prove it, so he wasn't charged. For years, the case has sat cold. Then in December 1989, the television show Unsolved Mysteries did a story about one of the suspects, David Fisher, who disappeared in 1974 after he escaped from prison. After the show aired, a tip came in that Fisher was living in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. He had been working as a door-to-door salesman, and he was married with 3 daughters. He was able to prove that he wasn't in Tacoma when the girls were killed. There was no progress on the cases for 17 years. Then in 2016, the police compared the DNA from Michelle's murder to the DNA from Jennifer's murder. It turned out that there was 2 different killers. The DNA was inputted into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, which is better known by its acronym, CODIS. But no match to either set of DNA was found. The police tracked down Robert Washburn, who had called the police after Michelle's murder, and admitted to being in both parks on the same days as the murders. In early 2018, he was living in Eureka, Illinois. The police asked for a sample of his DNA, and he voluntarily gave them a sample. It was a match to the DNA from Jennifer's murder. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. But the police still didn't know who killed Michelle Welch. Then Parabon Nanolabs became more involved in the case. They inputted Michelle's killer's DNA into a public genealogy database, and they discovered that the DNA belonged to one of 2 brothers who lived in Tacoma. Detectives then started to follow both of the brothers. One day in June 2018, detectives followed one of the brothers, 66-year-old Gary Hartman, into a restaurant, and they saw that he used a napkin to wipe his mouth. The police collected the napkin, and they pulled a DNA sample from it. It was then compared to the DNA of Michelle's killer. It was a match. On June 20th, 2018, Hartman was arrested, and he was charged with first-degree murder. Hartman lived in the area where Michelle was killed, but he wasn't a person of interest or a suspect. The police had no idea who he was until he was found through reverse genealogy. Hartman was a married father of 2. He was a registered nurse, and he worked at the Western State Hospital in Lakewood, Washington. His job was to find community placements for people leaving the state hospital. He did not have a criminal record, and the news of his arrest shocked everyone who knew him. Both Washburn and Hartman are expected to face trial in 2019. A detective who worked on Michelle's case had a message for any killer who left his or her DNA at a crime scene. He said that they should turn themselves in because with the help of reverse genealogy, it's only a matter of time before they will be arrested. Number 1. Arliss Perry. Arliss Dykma was born in North Dakota on February 22, 1955. A guiding force in her life from a young age was her evangelical Christian faith. She attended high school in Bismarck, North Dakota, where she was an active member of several Christian groups. In one of these groups, she met Bruce Perry, who was in the same grade as her. Both Arliss and Bruce graduated from high school in 1973. Arliss went to community college in Bismarck, and Bruce moved to Stanford, California to study pre-med at Stanford University. Bruce proposed to Arliss during their first year apart, and Arliss said yes. They got married on August 17, 1974, and Arliss took Bruce's last name. After their honeymoon, Arliss moved to Stanford to live with Bruce while he continued his studies. After relocating, Arliss got a job as a receptionist at a law firm. Life as a newlywed in a new city far from her friends and family was tough on Arliss at times. When life became stressful, she turned to her faith to help get her through. On September 17, 1974, the couple had been married for exactly 8 weeks. Late that night, Arliss decided to walk to campus to mail a letter, and Bruce joined her. As they walked through the campus, they got into a fight over something minor. One of their car's tires was slowly leaking air, and they argued over who was responsible for filling it with air. Arliss was annoyed, and she told Bruce that she was going to pray alone at the Stanford Memorial Church, which is on campus. Arliss entered the church at 11:50 and joined several other people who were praying. Everyone but Arliss left the church before midnight. As they walked out, a few people saw a young man with a medium build and light brown hair walk towards the church. At 12:10, a security guard named Stephen Crawford said he entered the rear of the church and yelled out that he was locking up for the night. Crawford said he didn't see anyone and the church was quiet, so he locked all the doors to the church. At 12:15, Bruce went to the church to check on Arliss because she had not returned home. When he got to the church, he found the doors locked. So he went back to the residence to await her return. At 2 a.m., Arliss still hadn't returned home, so Bruce went back to the church, and once again, he found the doors locked. By 3 a.m., Bruce still had not heard from or seen his wife, and he became worried. He called the campus police and reported her missing. An officer went to the church and found the doors locked, so he left. At 5:40 a.m., Stephen Crawford, the same security guard who locked the doors of the church at midnight, started to unlock the church's doors. When he got to a side door, he noticed something unusual. The door had been forced open from the inside. Crawford ventured into the church, and under one of the pews, he found the dead body of 19-year-old Arliss Perry. He left the church and called the police. When the police arrived, they found Arliss lying face up. She was naked from the waist down, and her jeans were lying on top of her. Her right hand was palm down, and her left hand was under her body in the waist area. She had been sexually violated with a 24-inch beeswax candle. Another 24-inch candle had been shoved between her breasts. The shove was so forceful that it ripped her bra straps. There were deep bruises on her neck. The bruises looked like they were made by the necklace that she was wearing. It was initially thought that Arliss had been strangled to death, but the autopsy revealed an entirely different cause of death. She had been stabbed at the base of the skull at a 45-degree angle with a 5.5-inch ice pick. The metal pick was still lodged in her head. The handle of the ice pick had broken off, and the killer took it with him. It's not believed that the killer raped Arliss, but the police did find a semen stain on a kneeling pillow that was placed beside her body. On one of the candles that was used to violate Arliss, the police found a palm print, which was the best evidence they had at the time. The first suspect was Arliss's husband, Bruce. His palm print was compared to the palm print that was found on the candle. It was not a match. Bruce was given a polygraph exam, and he passed, so he was cleared as a suspect. The next suspect was Stephen Crawford, the security guard who locked up the church and found Arliss's body. Just like Bruce, his palm print didn't match the palm print left on the candle. The police asked Crawford to take a polygraph exam, and he refused. But since his palm print didn't match the palm print left on the candle, the police had to look at other suspects. One of those suspects was serial killer Ted Bundy, but the police were able to confirm he wasn't in the area at the time of the murder. So he was eliminated as a suspect as well. Unfortunately, after ruling out those suspects, the police had no idea who killed Arliss. Since the gruesome murder happened in a church, there was speculation that the killing was satanic or occult in nature. But the police were clear from the early days of the investigation that the crime had no occult or satanic overtones. One detective said it just happened to occur in a church. Another investigator said that the crime seemed like the work of a sexual psychopath instead of the work of Satanists. But this didn't stop rumors and conspiracy theories that it was a satanic or occult murder. The rumors were somewhat bolstered in 1979. David Berkowitz, who is also known as the Son of Sam killer and the .44 caliber killer, sent a package to investigators in North Dakota. At the time, Berkowitz was sitting in prison in New York for the murders of 6 people. In the package was a book, The Anatomy of Witchcraft by Peter Haining. In the margins of one page, Berkowitz wrote, Arliss Perry, hunted, stalked, and slain. Followed to California. Call the Santa Clara Sheriff's Office. California, please ask the sheriffs happened to Arliss Perry. After getting the book, a detective interviewed Berkowitz about Arliss's murder. The interview didn't lead to any arrests. In 1987, Maury Terry, a reporter with the tabloid The New York Post, published a book called The Ultimate Evil. In the controversial book, Terry asserts that Arliss was killed on the orders of a satanic cult that was based in Bismarck, North Dakota. He called the founder of the cult Manson II. Terry said that Manson II was a former member of the Manson family. Terry then goes on to claim that Arliss was killed by a man named Bruce Perry. Not Arliss's husband, but a different man named Bruce Perry. After the book was published, the police still did not think that Arliss's murder was related to Satanism or the occult. For years, no progress was made on Arliss's case. When DNA testing became more prevalent, the Stanford police asked Bruce for his DNA. Bruce had gone on to become a doctor. He voluntarily gave the police a sample of his DNA. The police also picked up an object that had Stephen Crawford's DNA on it. However, it wouldn't be until 2018 that DNA technology had advanced enough that a profile from the DNA found at the crime scene could be developed. When they had the killer's DNA profile, they compared it to Bruce's DNA and Crawford's DNA. Bruce Perry's DNA did not match. Stephen Crawford's DNA was a match. In June 2018, weeks before his DNA was linked to the crime scene, detectives had interviewed Crawford, and he knew he was a person of interest. On the morning of June 28, 2018, the police pounded on the door of Crawford's apartment and they identified themselves. They said they had a warrant to search his apartment. He didn't answer the door, so the officers entered the apartment. When they got inside, they saw Crawford sitting on his bed. He was holding a gun. He was in a small room, so the officers backed their way out of the apartment. A few minutes later, they heard the distinctive sound of a gunshot. Crawford, who was 72, had shot himself in the head. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The police searched his apartment, and they found a book jacket of Terry Morey's book, The Ultimate Evil, which discusses Arliss's murder. They also found a suicide note that was dated 2 years earlier. He did not address the murder directly in the note. Friends and family of Crawford said that he had developed a hatred of Stanford. Crawford had worked as a police officer in Stanford. He joined the force in 1971. But the year after he joined the force, the chief of police implemented new qualifications for officers to carry guns. A lot of the officers were told to reapply for their jobs. About 3/4 of the people that reapplied were not hired back on. This included Crawford. The people who weren't rehired were offered jobs as security guards, and Crawford took the position. The situation made Crawford bitter. He continued to work at Stanford until 1976, about 2 years after Arliss's murder. During that time, Crawford stole artifacts, bronze statues, and rare books from the campus. In 1992, he was arrested in connection with the thefts. He pleaded no contest to the charges, and he was given a 6-month suspended sentence. The police suspect that Crawford killed Arliss as a way to lash out against Stanford. There is also speculation that Crawford committed other murders on and around the Stanford campus. At around 1 a.m. on September 11, 1973, about 13 months before Arliss was killed, 20-year-old physics student David Levine left the Stanford physics department and started to walk to his dorm. 2 hours later, a jogger discovered his body. He had been stabbed 13 times, a dozen times in the back and once in the chest. Then, about 6 months later, and 7 months before Arliss was killed, there was another murder. On the evening of March 24, 1974, 21-year-old Janet Ann Taylor was on the Stanford campus visiting friends. Janet was the daughter of the former director of athletics at Stanford, Chuck Taylor. She was last seen at an intersection on campus, hitchhiking towards home. Her dead body was found the next morning by a milk truck driver about 3 miles from the campus. Her body was in a ditch on the property that was owned by Stanford University. She was fully clothed, but she was missing her raincoat, her belt, and her shoes. Those were all found scattered along the road where her body was found. The cause of death was strangulation. The police department said they are looking to see if Stephen Crawford was involved in these murders as well. But for now, they are happy that, after 44 years, they can close the case on the murder of Arliss Perry. Number 3. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. In the video 3 Unsolved Mysteries with Mysterious Letters Part 3, we cover the murders of 20-year-old Jay Cook and 18-year-old Tanya Van Cuylenborg, who lived in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. The young couple had started dating in March 1987, and 6 months later, they decided to go on their first overnight trip. On November 18, 1987, they borrowed Cook's father's van and planned to drive to Seattle, Washington to do some camping and then drive back home the next day. The next evening, the couple still hadn't returned home, so their families contacted the police. The police were able to confirm that the couple had taken 2 ferries and made it to Seattle, but what happened to them after they got off the ferry was a mystery. 6 days after they left on their trip, Van Cuylenborg's half-naked body was found in a ditch near Alger, Washington, which is about 76 miles away from where they got off the ferry in Seattle. Her hands were bound with a zip tie, she had been sexually assaulted, and then she was shot to death. The next day, her wallet, some surgical gloves, more zip ties, a half-full box of ammunition, and the keys to the van were found in Bellingham, Washington, which is about 14 miles away from where her body was found. Later that same day, the van was found parked 2 blocks away from the items. The next day, Cook's body was found in Monroe, which is between Seattle and Alger. He had been beaten and strangled to death. The police theorized that the couple either met the killer on one of their ferry trips, or they picked him up as he was hitchhiking. Cook was killed first, and then the killer and Van Cuylenborg drove to Alger. Then a week after the bodies were found, the parents of both Cook and Van Cuylenborg received an unsettling letter. The author claimed that he was the killer, and he killed the couple because he hated Canadians. Then once every month for the next year, the parents would receive a disturbing letter, or for holidays like Father's Day and Mother's Day, they would get Hallmark greeting cards from the person who claimed to be the killer. In the letters and the cards, the author would taunt and mock the parents. The killer's DNA was found in the van, and a profile was developed. In 2010, the DNA found in the van was compared to the DNA found on the letters, and it wasn't a match. The police were able to track down the letter writer thanks to tips from people who recognized the handwriting. It turned out that a mentally ill Canadian man who was homeless wrote the letters during a low point in his life. He was not involved in the murders, and he did not know who committed them. The man, who was 73 years old, was not charged with anything. In April 2018, the police had this computer-generated image developed based on markers found in the killer's DNA. Then the same company that developed the image entered the killer's DNA into a family genealogy database. When they did, they found the killer's second cousins. Then they started filling out the family trees of the second cousins. Eventually, they got to the point where the family trees crossed through a marriage, and that marriage produced one son. That son is William Earl Talbot II, who lived in Seattle and drove trucks for about 30 years. He was 24 years old at the time of the murders. The police had a list of 300 suspects, and Talbot's name wasn't on it. The police had no idea who Talbot was until the DNA company found him through reverse genealogy. The police followed Talbot for several weeks, and then they saw him throw out a coffee cup that had his DNA on it. They picked up the coffee cup and got a sample of Talbot's DNA. It was compared to the DNA that was found in the van, and it was a match. Talbot was arrested on May 17, 2018, over 30 years after the murders. Number 2. Ashley Freeman and Laura Bible. In our 10th video, which was posted in November 2016, we detail the horrifying disappearance of Ashley Freeman and Laura Bible. On December 29, 1999, Ashley Freeman, who lived in Craig County, Oklahoma, turned 16 years old. To celebrate her birthday, her best friend, 16-year-old Laura Bible, came over to sleep at the mobile home that Ashley shared with her parents. At 5:30 a.m., the fire department was called to the mobile home. When the fire department arrived at the mobile home, they found it completely engulfed in flames. The fire department put out the fire, and among the ruins, they found the body of Ashley's mother, 37-year-old Kathy Freeman. She had been shot in the back of the head with a shotgun. The fire department searched the wreckage, but they didn't find the bodies of the 16-year-olds or the body of Ashley's 40-year-old father, Danny Freeman. At first, the police thought that Danny may have killed Kathy, torched the trailer, and then fled with the two girls. But then the day after the fire, Laura's parents were looking through the wreckage and they found some human remains. It was determined that the remains were Danny Freeman. Like his wife, he had been shot to death with a shotgun. The area around the trailer was searched, but no trace of the girls was found. Over the years, the case grew cold. In spring 2002, serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells confessed to the crime. When he confessed, Sells was sitting on death row in Texas for a murder that he committed 2 days before Kathy and Danny were killed and the girls went missing. Sells broke into a trailer home in Del Rio, Texas, and he stabbed 13-year-old Kayleen Harris to death and slit the throat of her friend who was sleeping over, 10-year-old Crystal Searles. Crystal survived the attack, and she picked Sells out of a photo lineup. Sells was arrested a short time later. He was convicted, and in November 2000, he was sentenced to death. Between 1980 and his arrest in early 2000, Sells was a drifter, and it's thought that he murdered over 22 men, women, and children. He would break into people's homes, or he would be invited in, and then he would kill every member of the family. Other times, like he did with Kayleen, he just killed the children in their beds and left their bodies for their parents to find in the morning. Sells later recanted his confession about killing the Freemans and kidnapping Ashley and Laura. He was executed in 2014 for the murder of Kayleen Harris. Another suspect in the double homicide and kidnapping was serial killer Jeremy Jones. Jones was arrested on September 19, 2004, 2 days after he sexually assaulted and shot to death 45-year-old Lisa Nichols in Turnersville, Georgia. After shooting Nichols 3 times in the head, he set her body on fire. Jones was arrested after he used Nichols' cell phone to call his girlfriend. In police custody, Jones admitted that, while he was high on methamphetamine, he killed Lisa Nichols. Jones then said that Nichols wasn't his only victim. In a rambling confession, Jones claimed to have killed 21 people in 6 states. This included the Freemans and Laura Bible. He said that he killed the parents over a drug debt. He then took the girls to an abandoned mine in Kansas, where he shot them to death. The police searched the area where he said the girls' bodies were located, but they didn't find any trace of the girls. Jones later recanted his confession. Jones was convicted of the murder of Lisa Nichols, and he was sentenced to death. It's believed that he killed at least 4 other people. For over a decade, no other promising suspects emerged, and no evidence was found that could link either Sells or Jones to the crime. No trace of the girls was found either. Then in February 2017, cold case investigators found a box of documents pertaining to the case. The documents led to 2 private investigators who worked on the case. One of the private investigators gave the cold case investigators a piece of evidence that he found at the crime scene. It was an insurance card for a vehicle. The police interviewed the owner of the card, and she told them something that she had been keeping for a secret for a long time. She said she was sure that her former boyfriend, Warren Welch, was involved in the murders of the Freemans and the kidnapping of the 2 girls. She said she was sure because when Welch was in prison on drug charges, she found a briefcase in his trailer that contained some disturbing Polaroid photographs. In the pictures were 2 teenage girls. In some of the pictures, the girls were duct taped to chairs. In another, the girls are lying on a bed facing each other. There was another Polaroid of the girls on the bed, and Welch was laying with them. The woman hid the Polaroids, and when Welch got out of prison, he was angry to discover that the Polaroids weren't in the place where he left them. He called the woman and demanded to know what she did with them. She told him where they were, and then he threatened her. He told her that if she told anyone about the Polaroids, he would kill her and dump her body in a pit, just like the girls in the pictures. Before Welch went to prison, The woman said that he hung up the girls' missing posters on a wall in his trailer. The cold case investigators interviewed other people who knew Welch, and several other people saw the Polaroids as well. The witnesses were able to help the police piece together what happened on the night that the girls went missing. Warren Welch was a meth cooker, and he worked with a dealer named David Pennington. On the night of the fire, Welch, Pennington, and a third man named Ronnie Busick went to the Freeman's trailer to sell the score after a bad drug deal. They killed Kathy and David and then decided to take the girls for some quote-unquote fun. The girls were kept alive for a few days in Welch's trailer. Then the girls tried to run away and they were strangled to death. Their bodies were then supposedly dumped in a pit in Pitcher, Oklahoma, not far from Welch's trailer. The collection of Polaroids has never been found. The three men would show the Polaroids to people to threaten them and to brag. Supposedly, over a dozen people knew about the Polaroids, but said nothing. Welch died in 2007, and Pennington died in 2015, but Ronnie Busick is still alive. He was arrested in April 2018, nearly 18 and a half years after the crime. The families are now just hoping that the remains of Ashley and Laura will be found soon. Number 1. The Golden State Killer. In our 4th ever video, we cover the case of the original Night Stalker. The killer is now commonly known as the Golden State Killer, which is a name that was coined by true crime writer Michelle McNamara. McNamara, who was the wife of comedian Patton Oswalt, was writing a book about the Golden State Killer when she passed away in 2016 because of an undiagnosed heart condition. It was originally thought that the Golden State Killer committed his first murder on December 30th, 1979 in Goleta, California. The bodies of 44-year-old Dr. Robert Offerman and his 35-year-old girlfriend, Dr. Deborah Manning, were found in Offerman's condominium. Manning was lying face down on the bed. Her wrists were bound with twine, and she had been shot once in the back of the head. Offerman was on his knees at the foot of the bed. He had been shot 3 times in the back. He had twine tied around one of his wrists. It's believed that the killer forced Manning to tie up Offerman, but she didn't tie him up tightly. Offerman was able to free himself, and he tried to fight off the attacker. Sadly, he ultimately failed. One thing that the police noted was that the knot used to tie up Manning was an unusual knot called a diamond knot. On March 16, 1980, 3.5 months after Offerman and Manning were killed, there was another deadly home invasion. This time it was in Ventura, California, which is about 35 miles away from Goleta. Lyman Smith was 43 years old, and he was a respected attorney. He was looking forward to being appointed a Superior Court judge by the end of the month. Lyman lived with his second wife, Charlene, and she was 33 years old. On the afternoon of March 16th, Lyman's 12-year-old son from his first marriage rode his bike to his father's home. The front door was unlocked, and when he stepped into the house, he heard an alarm clock going off in the master bedroom. He made his way to the bedroom, and he saw something that he will never forget. His father and stepmother had been brutally murdered. The medical examiner determined that they had been beaten to death with a log from the fireplace. They both had been tied up with a drapery cord. Again, the cord had been tied with a diamond knot. Before she died, Charlene had been sexually assaulted. 6 months later, Roger Harrington went to the home where his son, 24-year-old Keith Harrington, lived with his new wife, 27-year-old Patrice Harrington, in a gated community called Dana Point. Keith was in his 3rd year of medical school, and Patrice was a nurse. When Roger entered the home, he noticed that it was unusually quiet. He went into his son and daughter-in-law's bedroom and found them lying face down in their bed that was drenched in blood. There were ligature marks around their wrists, but whatever was used to tie them up wasn't found at the crime scene. Patrice had been sexually assaulted, and then the couple was bludgeoned to death with a sprinkler head that the killer found in the backyard. Like the ligatures, the sprinkler head wasn't found at the crime scene. Another 5 months went by, and then on February 5th, 1981, the father of 28-year-old Manuela Winhutton received a call from the bank where she worked. She didn't show up for work, and they couldn't get a hold of her. They also couldn't get a hold of her husband because he was in the hospital with a gastrovirus. Her father went to their middle-class home in Irvine, California, and he found his daughter's dead body in her bed. There were signs that she had been tied up and sexually assaulted. She was beaten to death, most likely with a lamp that was missing from the house. Once again, 5 months went by, and then the police were called to a home in Goleta, about a half a mile away from where Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning were killed. 35-year-old Sherry Domingo was house sitting for a relative, and her boyfriend, 27-year-old Gregory Sanchez, had spent the night. Once again, there were marks on their wrists that indicated that the couple had been tied up, but the ligatures were missing. The couple was beat to death. The murder weapon was missing, but it's thought that the killer used a crowbar that he found in the tool shed. On May 4th, 1989, about 5 years after the last couple was killed, 18-year-old Janelle Cruz was at home alone in her family's home in Irvine, California. Her family was away on vacation, and Cruz didn't go with them because she couldn't get time away from her job at a local pizzeria. That night, she had a friend over, and they heard a noise in the backyard. They looked out the window and saw nothing. They just assumed that the noise was an animal. A short time later, they heard a noise in the garage, but Cruz thought it was just the washing machine. At about 10:45 p.m., the friend left, and Cruz was home alone. The next day, a realtor who was showing the Cruz's home discovered her body. The murder weapon was missing, but was thought to be a pipe wrench that the killer found in the backyard. After Cruz's murder, the killings came to an end. Since the 10 murders took place over a distance of 200 miles, it took the police a long time to piece together that one person was responsible for all 10 murders. However, eventually the investigators couldn't ignore the similarities between the crimes. The killer seemed to target couples who lived in middle to upper class homes. Most of the victims were tied up and then killed with a weapon that the killer found in or around the home. He entered his victims' homes through unlocked doors or by prying open a sliding patio door. They called the killer the original Night Stalker. By the late 1990s, the original Night Stalker had not been identified, but some progress had been made on the case. Several investigators were confident that the murders weren't the only series of crimes that the killer committed. They also thought he was responsible for a series of 45 sexual assaults in the area east of Sacramento, California. The attacks started in March 1976, and they came to an end around the time that the original Night Stalker murders began. The murders and the sexual assaults shared several commonalities. Notably, many of the sexual assault victims had been tied up using a diamond knot. The rapists also attacked people, quite often couples, in their home. He would tie up both the man and the woman, and then sexually assault the woman while the man watched. In some cases, he would step up the psychological torture. For example, after he tied up the male partner, he would balance a stack of dishes on him. He would tell the man that if the stack of dishes fell, he would kill them both. He was then forced to watch as the attacker sexually assaulted his partner. That criminal was known as the East Area Rapist. Besides the 45 sexual assaults, it's believed that the East Area Rapist also committed a double homicide. On February 2, 1978, 21-year-old Brian Majori and his 20-year-old wife, Katie Majori, were walking their dog near their home in Rancho Cordova, California. As they walked, they were confronted by a man holding a gun and wearing a ski mask. The masked man led them into the backyard of one of their neighbors. Once they were in the backyard, the couple tried to run away, and they were both shot to death. Ryan was shot in the chest, and Katie was shot in the head. In 2001, the DNA from the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were compared, and they were a match. Unfortunately, the DNA didn't match anyone in the database. For years, the police, the FBI, reporters, and true crime writers investigated the Golden State Killer. Sketches of the killer were released to the public, as were a letter he supposedly sent, and pages from a notebook that was found near one of the crime scenes. They also released recordings of phone calls he may have placed. An example is this recording from 1977 that was left on a woman's answering machine. But unfortunately, despite the amount of information that was made public, it didn't lead to an arrest. Then, an investigator with Contra Costa County named Paul Holes entered the Golden State Killer's DNA into a consumer DNA database called GEDmatch. He found about 20 distant relatives of the Golden State Killer. He was able to trace their families back to a common ancestor, which was a set of great-great-great-grandparents who lived in the 1800s. From those common ancestors, Holes and his team started to fill out 25 family trees, looking for a man who was about the same age as the Golden State Killer. This eventually led to 72-year-old Joseph James D'Angelo, who lived in Citrus Heights, a Sacramento suburb. Holes thought that D'Angelo was an interesting suspect. It turned out that D'Angelo was a former police officer. From 1976 to 1979, when the East Area Rapist was active, he was a police officer on the Auburn, California police force. He was fired from the police force in 1979 after he was caught shoplifting some dog repellent and a hammer. Also, on his record, it showed that he purchased 2 guns. He bought each gun shortly before the Golden State Killer used a gun in his murders. The police followed D'Angelo, and one day he drove to a Hobby Lobby. When he went into the store, the police took a sample of his DNA from the door handle of his car. Another sample was taken from a garbage can lid that he left outside of his home. Both samples were a match to the Golden State Killer. On April 27, 2018, D'Angelo was arrested and he was charged with 8 counts of murder, and it's expected that more charges are still to come. Besides connecting him to the 45 sexual assaults and the 12 murders, D'Angelo was also linked to another string of crimes and a 13th murder. Between March 1974 and late 1975, before the sexual assault started, it's suspected that D'Angelo broke into over 100 homes in Visalia, California. He would trash the house and then only take small items. Before D'Angelo was identified as the suspect, the perpetrator was called the Visalia Ransacker. On September 11, 1975, near the end of D'Angelo's reign of terror as the Ransacker, 45-year-old Claude Snelling, who was a professor of journalism, was awoken by a noise in his home in Visalia. He went to his carport and saw a man in a ski mask trying to kidnap his daughter. The masked man shot Snelling twice and ran away. Snelling later died from his wounds. What is known about D'Angelo is that he served in the Navy during the Vietnam War. In 1973, when he was 27, he married a 20-year-old woman who went on to become a lawyer. They had 3 daughters together, but they ultimately divorced. In 1973, D'Angelo was hired to be a police officer in Exeter, California. He worked there until 1976, and then he joined the police force in Auburn. He was then fired for shoplifting in 1979. Around the same time that he was fired, the original Night Stalker murders began. In 1992, he got a job at a grocery distribution center in Roseville, which is a Sacramento suburb. He retired from the distribution center in 2017 after working there for 27 years. It's unknown where or if he worked between 1979 and 1992. When D'Angelo was arrested, the 72-year-old was living with his daughter and granddaughter. D'Angelo was never considered a suspect, and he was only found because of the hard work of Paul Holes and his team. The families of the victims are thankful that the Golden State Killer was finally arrested. Number 3. Susan Galvin. Susan Galvin was born and raised in Spokane, Washington. She was the oldest of 8 siblings. In 1966, when she was 19, she moved to Seattle, Washington. She got a job with the Seattle Police Department as a records clerk. In her spare time, Galvin often visited the Seattle Center. The Seattle Center is a sprawling entertainment, arts, and educational complex. Its best-known landmark is the Space Needle. On July 9, 1967, about a year after Galvin moved to Seattle, her dead body was found in an elevator in a parking garage on the grounds of the Seattle Center. The 20-year-old had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. The police made Galvin's murder investigation a top priority. Since she worked for the police department, the detectives considered her to be one of their own. Early suspects in the case were some naval officers, but nothing was found that could tie them to the murder. The police's prime suspect was a professional clown who worked at the Seattle Center who went by the stage name Punchy. Just hours before Galvin's body was found, she was seen with Punchy at the Seattle Center. Then, just days after her body was found, Punchy quit working at the Seattle Center. But the police could not find any evidence that linked him to the case, so he wasn't ever charged. Despite the police putting a lot of effort into the case, it went cold. Over the years, the police would follow up on possible leads, but it never led to an arrest. Then in 2002, a detective reopened the case. He found out that the clothes Galvin was wearing when she was attacked were still in evidence. The clothing had been in storage for 35 years, but amazingly, they were well preserved. The clothing was sent to a crime lab, and forensic experts found male DNA on the clothes. They were able to develop a DNA profile. The profile was then entered into the Combined DNA Index System, better known by its acronym, CODIS. But no match was found. So the case was shelved once again. In 2016, the case was opened again. This time, the detective decided to track down the prime suspect, Punchy the Clown. The detective found him living in Utah, and he asked him for a DNA sample. Punchy the Clown voluntarily gave a sample of his DNA, and it was compared to the DNA left on Galvin's clothing. It was not a match. Then in April 2018, something happened that altered the course of the investigation. The Sheriff's Department in Sacramento, California, announced that they had arrested the Golden State Killer. Between June 1976 and July 1979, it's believed that the Golden State Killer, also known as the original Night Stalker, had killed at least 13 people. The Sheriff's Department explained that a company called Parabon Nanolabs had entered the killer's DNA profile into the public genealogy database, GEDmatch. They found distant relatives of the Golden State Killer, and then they traced their family tree. This led to them identifying Joseph James D'Angelo as the Golden State Killer. The detective who was working on Susan Galvin's case thought that Parabon Nanolabs could help solve the Golden State Killer case. Perhaps they could help solve Galvin's murder. So the detective sent the killer's DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs, and they entered the profile into the GEDmatch database. They found two distant cousins of the killer. The cousins share less than 2% of the killer's DNA. This led the researcher to two more distant cousins, one who was born in 1828 and one who was born in 1837. The researcher then kept filling out the family tree of the killer. Eventually, this led to a man named Frank Whippage. The researcher immediately thought that Whippage was a viable suspect. Whippage was born in Seattle, and he was 26 years old when Galvin was killed. The researcher passed this information on to the detective in Seattle. In turn, he researched Whippage's background. Whippage had served in the Army. When Galvin was killed, he was living in Seattle. In fact, he was working at the Seattle Center as a security guard. At the time of the murder, he had a wife and a young son. 2 years later, his wife gave birth to another son. The problem was that the investigator could not ask Whippage for a sample of his DNA. That was because Whippage had been dead for 32 years. He had died in 1987 at the age of 46 from complications from diabetes. In early 2019, the detective got in touch with one of Whippage's close family members and asked for a sample of DNA. They voluntarily gave a sample. Their DNA was then compared to Galvin's killer's DNA. The match was close enough that the detective was able to get a court order to get Whippage's remains exhumed. His remains were exhumed in February 2019, and his bones were sent for DNA testing. On April 12, 2019, the detective was notified that Whippage's DNA was a match to Galvin's killer's DNA. Shortly after he was notified of the match, the Seattle Police Department held a press conference where they announced that Susan Galvin's murder had finally been solved. Frank Whippage's family was shocked by the revelation. None of them had any idea he was a murderer. Whippage had only 2 run-ins with the law. In 1971, he was arrested and convicted of larceny. He ended up serving 9 months in jail. However, what he did to get charged with larceny is unknown. His wife divorced him around the time he was convicted. Whippage was arrested again in 1975 for impersonating a police officer. He was caught making traffic stops while he was armed with a gun. Although he was arrested, for unknown reasons, he never went to court to face the charges. While Whippage was serving in the Army, he was stationed in New York, Alaska, and Germany. The police are currently looking at unsolved murders in those areas that happened while Whippage was stationed there. They do not think that 20-year-old Susan Galvin was his only victim. At the time of this video, Galvin's murder, which was solved after 53 years, is the oldest case to be solved by genetic genealogy. Number 2. Jane Antoinez and Patricia Dwyer. Atascadero is a city in California. It is situated along Route 101 in between San Francisco and Los Angeles. In the late 1970s, Atascadero had a population of around 15,000 people. One of the citizens was Jane Antoinez. In the fall of 1977, Antoinez was 30 years old. She was divorced and she was living with her parents. Antoinez had worked at the San Luis Obispo County Welfare Department, but she had quit her job to take care of her mother, who had a heart condition. On the night November 17, 1977, Antoinez was planning on visiting her best friend. She left her family's home in her father's car. The next afternoon, her family became concerned because she had not returned home and they had not heard from her. They called her friend, and she told them that Antoinez never showed up. Antoinez's brother got into his car and he went looking for her. On a dead-end street off of Route 101, not far from their home, he found his father's car. In the back seat of the car was the dead body of his sister. Her throat had been slashed. Her hands had been bound behind her back, and some of her clothing had been removed. The medical examiner later determined that she had been sexually assaulted. The police investigated the murder, but no arrests were made in the wake of the killing. Another resident of Atascadero was 28-year-old Patricia Dwyer. Dwyer worked as a psychiatric technician at Atascadero State Hospital. She lived by herself in a house on a quiet street. On January 11, 1978, Dwyer didn't show up for work. That afternoon, one of Dwyer's friends stopped by her house to visit her. When she got inside the house, she made a horrible discovery. Dwyer's partially nude dead body was lying on the floor. She had been stabbed once in the chest with a knife from the kitchen. Her hands were bound behind her back. The medical examiner concluded that she had been sexually assaulted. For several reasons, the police thought that the two murders were connected. Both murders happened within 2 months of each other. Both victims were white, had dark hair, and they were similar in age. They both had their hands bound behind their back, they were both sexually assaulted, and they were both killed with a knife. The police were pretty sure that Dwyer knew her killer, and Antoinez possibly did as well. At Dwyer's home, the police found no signs of a break-in or forced entry. Dwyer's friend said she always kept her doors locked and she never let strangers into her home. So the police thought that Dwyer knew her killer and she let him into her home. They thought it was possible that Antoinez knew her killer and let him get into her car. She possibly offered him a ride. Antoinez and Dwyer didn't know each other, but they did have several friends in common. They also both frequented the same bar, the Tally Ho. The police interviewed friends of both women and patrons of the bar. However, it did not lead to any arrests. It wasn't long before the cases went cold. In 2005, the cases were reopened. Evidence was saved from the crime scenes, and they were tested for DNA. Male DNA was found on evidence from both crime scenes, and it was compared. It confirmed what the police always believed: the same man killed both women. The DNA was then entered into CODIS, but no match to the DNA was found. Atascadero is in San Luis Obispo County. In 2016, the San Luis Obispo Sheriff's Office hired a detective to look into cold cases. In 2018, he started looking into cases from the 1970s. Two of the cases he started to investigate were the murders of Jane Antonez and Patricia Dwyer. The cold case detective then handed the DNA profile over to the Justice Department's familial DNA search team. In February 2018, the team located a relative of the killer. He was an inmate who was in jail for an unrelated crime. He confirmed he had a relative who lived in Atascadero at the time of the murders. His name was Arthur Rudy Martinez. Martinez had a horrifying criminal record. In the spring of 1967, Martinez was living in Selma, California. In May 1967, Martinez shot a 28-year-old woman in her right hip just outside of her home. A short time after that, he robbed a 16-year-old girl. He fired his gun at her, but he missed. On June 21, 1967, Martinez was still out on the streets. He broke into a store that was closed. He was surprised to find the 48-year-old business owner inside the store. He sexually assaulted her and then shot her in the head. Amazingly, the woman survived the shooting. Martinez was arrested in a cafe a few hours later. In November 1967, he pleaded guilty to sexual assault and assault to commit murder. He was given a sentence of 1 to 50 years in prison. He ended up serving about 10 years, and then he was paroled. After he was paroled, he moved to Atascadero. This was about 6 or 7 months before Jane Antonez was killed. Then Martinez left Atascadero just days after Dwyer's murder. At the time of the murders, Martinez was briefly considered a suspect because he was on parole for a violent crime, but the police had no evidence to connect him to the murders. After leaving Atascadero, Martinez made his way to Spokane, Washington. While living there, he committed a series of sexual assaults and robberies. He was arrested, and in November 1978, he was sentenced to life in prison. Then, in 1994, after he had served about 15 years, Martinez escaped from prison. After he escaped, he moved back to the Fresno area and lived under an alias. Then in 2014, about 20 years after he escaped, he returned to Spokane and turned himself in. When Martinez turned himself in, he had cancer. He thought he would get better health care in prison. About 2 months after he turned himself in, he died in prison. He was a week shy of his 66th birthday. Supposedly, Martinez never told anyone, not even on his deathbed, that he had murdered the 2 women. Since Martinez had been dead for nearly 5 years, the cold case investigator had a problem. He couldn't get a DNA sample from Martinez to prove that he was the killer. So the cold case investigator tracked down the woman who Martinez had been living with while he was on the lam. Amazingly, even though Martinez had been dead for nearly 5 years, the woman still had one of his razors in her bathroom. She gave it to the cold case detective, and he had it tested for DNA. They found some DNA, and it was compared to the killer's DNA. The DNA was a match. In April 2019, the San Luis Obispo Sheriff's Office announced that after 41 years, the murders of Jane Antonez and Patricia Dwyer had finally been solved. Number 1. Janet Ann Taylor. Charles Taylor, who went by the name Chuck, had an illustrious career at Stanford University. In the early 1940s, he played guard for the university's football team. In 1940, the football team was undefeated. The next year, they won the Rose Bowl. In 1942, when Chuck was a senior, he was named All-American. 9 years later, in 1951, Chuck was made head coach of the Stanford football team. In 1952, he was named the AFCA Coach of the Year. He was 31, which makes him the youngest recipient of the award ever. Chuck Taylor served as head coach of the football team until 1957. In 1963, Chuck was made the head of athletics at Stanford University. He held the position until 1972, and then he retired. Chuck, his wife, and their 3 children lived in Atherton, California, which is an affluent village not far from the Stanford campus. Chuck's youngest daughter was Janet Ann Taylor. Janet graduated from high school in 1970 and then attended Canada College in Redwood City, California. In March 1974, Janet got a job as an office worker and teletypist at a weather forecasting service in Palo Alto, California, which wasn't far from her family's home. Around the same time that Janet got the job, her car broke down. Even though she had been warned not to, Janet hitchhiked to get around. On the evening of March 24, 1974, Janet was visiting a friend who lived on the campus of Stanford University. Her friend offered to let her spend the night, but Janet turned her down. Janet had 2 dogs at home, and she needed to get home to feed them. She left her friend's home, and she was seen hitchhiking at an intersection near the campus, heading in the direction of her home. The next morning, a milk truck driver was traveling along a side road about 3 miles from the Stanford campus. The road was on a piece of property that was owned by Stanford. The driver noticed something odd in the ditch, so he pulled over. What he found was the dead body of a young woman. He called the police, and officers arrived a short time later. The body was identified as 21-year-old Janet Ann Taylor. The medical examiner determined that she had been strangled to death. The killer most likely used his bare hands to strangle her, or he possibly used the turtleneck she was wearing. Janet's body was fully clothed except for her belt, her shoes, and her raincoat. Those pieces of clothing were found scattered along the same road where her body was found. The medical examiner determined that Janet had not been sexually assaulted. The case was a top priority for the police, but no arrests were made in the aftermath of the murder. Janet's murder happened during a time when there was a rash of murders connected to Stanford University. The first one happened 13 months before Janet was killed. Leslie Marie Perlaw was a graduate of Stanford. In February 1973, she was 21 years old, and she was working as a clerk at a law library a few miles from the campus. She lived with her widowed mother in the town of Los Altos Hills. On February 13, 1973, Perloff went to work. At the end of the workday, she got into her car and started driving home. But sadly, she never made it there. Her car was found abandoned on the same day that she went missing, near a quarry about 2.5 miles from her workplace. 3 days after Perloff went missing, her body was found under an oak tree in the foothills behind the Stanford campus in an area known as the Dish. She had been strangled with her scarf, which was still wrapped around her throat when she was found. Her skirt had been pulled up, but she had not been sexually assaulted. 7 months later, at around 1 a.m. on September 11, 1973, 20-year-old physics student David Levine left the Stanford physics department and started walking to his dorm. 2 hours later, a jogger on campus found his dead body. He had been stabbed 13 times. 6 months later, in March 1974, Janet Ann Taylor was strangled to death after leaving the Stanford campus. 7 months after that, on the night of October 11, 1974, 19-year-old Arliss Perry, the wife of a Stanford student, was visiting the Stanford Memorial Church, which is on the Stanford campus. Perry did not return home that night. Her body was found the next morning on the floor of the church. There were signs that she had been strangled, but the cause of death was a stab wound. She had been stabbed in the back of the head with an ice pick. The police who arrived at the church did not know that because the metal pick was fully embedded in her head and the handle had broken off. The killer took the handle of the ice pick with him when he left the church. Lying next to Perry's body was a pillow with semen on it. For decades, all 4 murders remained unsolved and the cases were considered cold. There was some speculation that some of, if not all the murders, were committed by one individual. But since no arrests were made in any of the cases, the police could only speculate. Then in June 2018, there was a massive break in one of the cases. A longtime suspect in the murder of Arliss Perry was a man named Stephen Crawford. Crawford was a campus security guard at Stanford, and he was the one who found Perry's body. In June 2018, the police interviewed Crawford again, and they told him that he was a person of interest in Perry's murder. They asked him for a sample of his DNA, but he refused to give them one. So a detective trailed him and then picked up an object he discarded, which had his DNA on it. His DNA was then compared to the DNA that was found on the pillow that was beside Perry's body. It was a match. On June 28, 2018, the police went to arrest Crawford at his home. Instead of surrendering, Crawford, who was 72, took his own life by shooting himself in the head. Crawford did not have much of a criminal record. In 1992, he was arrested for stealing artifacts, bronze statues, and rare books from the Stanford campus in the early 1970s while he was working as a security guard. He was given a 6-month suspended sentence. Other than that, the police thought that Crawford had stayed out of trouble. 5 months after Crawford's suicide, there was another break in one of the unsolved cases. Male DNA had been found on evidence from Leslie Marie Perloff's crime scene. The DNA profile was sent to Parabon Nanolabs. They were able to trace the DNA back to a 74-year-old man named John Arthur Getrew. Getrew had a disturbing criminal record. In June 1963, Getrew was 18 years old, and he was living with his family in Germany. His father was a sergeant major with the Army, and he was stationed in Germany. On the night of June 7, 1963, 16-year-old Margaret Williams, the daughter of an Army chaplain who was stationed at the same base as Getrew's father, attended a dance. Sadly, Margaret did not come home that night. Her body was found the next day on a baseball diamond behind an American Youth Center. She had been sexually assaulted, and then she was strangled to death. Getrew was arrested days later. In November 1963, Getrew pleaded guilty to murder. He was considered a youth in the German justice system, so he was sentenced to the maximum sentence for a youth, which was 10 years. He was paroled after serving only 2 years, and then he moved back to the United States. In 1973, when Perlov was killed, Getrew was 29, and he was working at Stanford University's hospital. He was a medical tech in the heart transplant unit. Getrew was arrested again in 1975 for sexual assault, and he was sentenced to 6 months in jail. On November 20th, 2018, over 45 years after Perlov was murdered, the police arrested Getrew at his home in Hayward, California. After Getrew was arrested, the police decided to send evidence from Janet Ann Taylor's murder to Parabon Nanolabs to have it tested for DNA. They found some male DNA. It turned out that the killer was already on the police's radar. Janet Ann Taylor was murdered by John Arthur Getrew, the man who killed Leslie Marie Perloff. In May 2018, 45 years after Janet's murder, Getrew was charged with her murder. Getrew has claimed he is not guilty. His first preliminary hearing is scheduled for November 2019. The September 1973 murder of 20-year-old physics student David Levine is the only murder from the early 1970s connected to Stanford that remains unsolved. Number 3. Tony Muncie. Richard Pestle lived in Galeno, Ohio, which is a village about 20 miles from downtown Columbus. On the morning of October 16, 1983, Pestle drove to a store in nearby Delaware, Ohio, to buy some milk. As he drove home, he watched for a deer on the side of the road. Instead, he saw something odd on the side of the road. It was three garbage bags. It looked like an elbow was coming out of one of the bags. Pestle pulled over. He got a closer look at the bags. He realized that it wasn't an elbow. Instead, it was a human leg. Pestle got in contact with the sheriff's department. Inside the bags were the dismembered remains of a teenage boy. He was nude, and some of his clothes were in the bags. The medical examiner thought he had been dead less than 24 hours. The police were able to determine that the victim was 15-year-old John Muncie, who went by the name Tony. Tony was in the ninth grade. He loved hard rock bands like AC/DC and Kiss. Tony lived with his family on the east side of Columbus. The night before Tony's body was found, he had gone out to see his girlfriend. He was planning on spending the night at a friend's home. So when Tony didn't come home that night, his parents weren't worried. Unfortunately, Tony never made it to his friend's home. The police thought that Tony was killed elsewhere, possibly Columbus, and then his body was dumped on the side of the road. The cause of death was multiple stab wounds to the back. The medical examiner concluded that Tony had been stabbed while he was still dressed. There was a hole in his jacket that appeared to have been made by a knife. The medical examiner thought that after he was undressed, he was undressed. The medical examiner did not find any evidence of sexual assault. Tony's body was then mutilated and dismembered. Blood that was found on some evidence was tested. The results revealed that there were two different blood types. The police concluded that the second blood type was the killer's blood. But since it was 1983, the police couldn't do much else with the blood. The police had no suspects released, and it wasn't long before the brutal murder went cold. 27 years later, in 2010, the police reopened the case. They had a DNA profile made, but they couldn't find a match to it. Then, 8 years later, investigators heard about Snohomish County, Washington, that was solved after 31 years. It was the murders of 20-year-old Jay Cook and 18-year-old Tanya Van Kylenborg. We cover their case in the videos, three unsolved mysteries with mysterious letters, part 3 major updates on previously featured on Criminally Listed. DNA technology company Parabon Nail Labs was responsible for the break in the case. Using GEDmatch, which is an online database of DNA profiles, they were able to find distant relatives of the killer. Then they filled out the branches of the relatives' family tree until it led them to the identity of the killer. Is a process that's called forensic genealogy. In the case of Cook and Van Kylenborg, the killer was William Earl Talbot II. In June 2019, Talbot became the first person convicted of murder after being identified by forensic genealogy. Talbot was given 2 life sentences. The investigators working on Tony Muncie's case with Parabon Nano Labs, and they agreed to help. In April 2020, the police in Columbus announced that the case had been solved. Parabon Nano Labs had narrowed it down to 3 brothers. The police were able to eliminate 2 of the brothers as suspects. The third brother was Daniel Allen Anderson. The police did not release many details about Anderson. What is known about him is that he was born and raised in Columbus. When Tony was murdered, Anderson was 30 years old. Anderson had a criminal record which included acts of violence against young boys. However, it was too late for Daniel Anderson to face justice for what he did. Anderson died in 2013 at the age of 60. The police now consider the murder of John Tony Muncie to be closed. Number 2, Peggy Beck. In the summer of 1963, Margaret Beck, who went by the name Peggy, was 16 years old. She lived in Edgewater, Colorado, which is a municipality west of Denver. Peggy lived with her parents and her 3 sisters. When Peggy was 9, she joined the Girl Scouts. In that summer of 1963, 16-year-old Peggy was made a Girl Scout counselor. On August 14th, Peggy was at the Flying G Girl Scouts camp near Decker, Colorado. She was on a 5-day trip with 105 girls between the ages of 12 and 14. There was also 27 supervisors. Many of the supervisors were mothers of the Girl Scouts. Peggy and another counselor, Claudia Stride, were sharing a tent. On the last night of the trip, Claudia wasn't feeling well, so she stayed in the infirmary. The next morning, Peggy didn't come to breakfast. Claudia went to their tent, and she found Peggy still in her sleeping bag. Claudia thought she was still sleeping. It turned out the 16-year-old Peggy Beck was dead. The leaders of the Girl Scout group had died of natural causes. The day Peggy was found dead was the last scheduled day of camp. So they kept her death a secret and had all the campers pack up. Claudia cleaned up the tent where Peggy died, and she took everything out of it. 8 hours after Peggy was found dead, the sheriff's department was notified. When Peggy's body was transferred to the morgue, it was still in the sleeping bag. At the morgue, her body was removed from the sleeping bag, and an employee noted something alarming. Peggy's leotards and her underwear had been ripped. An autopsy was immediately ordered. The medical examiner quickly concluded that 16-year-old Peggy Beck had been murdered. She had been sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. The medical examiner noted that Peggy put up a fight. Some of her fingernails were broken. The FBI assisted with the case. They collected the scrapings from under the fingernails. The police interviewed everyone who was at the camp. Peggy was sleeping in a tent that was about 75 feet from the closest tent. No one at the camp saw or heard anything unusual. The police followed up on several leads, but no one ever went to trial for the murder. The police thought it was unlikely that they would solve the case. They thought that any evidence that may have existed had accidentally been cleaned up by one of the Girl Scouts. Decades went by, and the murder of Peggy Beck was largely forgotten. In 2007, the case was reopened. Amazingly, the scrapings from under Peggy's fingernails have been saved and preserved. Using the scrapings, the police were able to get a DNA profile of the killer. However, they did not find a match to the DNA. 12 years later, in 2018, the case was examined again. In June 2018, the police got an approved DNA profile. They gave the profile to a company called United Data Connect. United Data Connect is a computer science that does familial DNA searches. They were able to trace the DNA to a suspect. In April 2020, the police announced that the killer's name was James Raymond Taylor. At the time of the murder, Taylor was 24 years old, and he was working as a TV repairman. In the 1960s, Taylor lived in Edgewater, which is the same municipality where Peggy lived with her family. Edgewater is over 60 miles from the campground. It's unknown if Taylor knew Peggy before he killed her, or if he targeted her. It may have just been a coincidence that they both lived in the same municipality. Taylor was known to go to the campground where the murder happened, to test ham radios that he had built. After the police got the DNA results, they tried to track down Taylor, who had been 81 years old. They aren't sure when he moved away from Colorado, but in the early 1970s, he was living in Las Vegas, Nevada. He had a rap sheet in Nevada, but the police did not give details about his criminal record. The last time anyone saw or heard from Taylor was in 1976. At the time, he was still living in Las Vegas, Nevada. There is currently a warrant for the arrest of James Raymond Taylor, but the police suspect that he may be dead. If he is still alive, the police want him to face justice for the brutal murder he committed. Margaret Peggy Beck's murder was solved after 56 years. The investigators believe it was the oldest case solved by genealogical testing found at a crime scene. Number 1, Jacqueline Harp, Irene Blaze, and Denise Velasca. On October 30th, 1967, two girls in Montvale, New Jersey, were playing in an upstairs bedroom in their house. They looked at the window, and on the street below, they noticed something odd. It looked like there was a mannequin in the back seat of a car. The girls decided to get a closer look. After they looked in the car, they ran to their neighbor's home, and their neighbor called the police. What they had found was the dead body of a woman. The police determined that she was 29-year-old Nancy Vogel. Vogel was married and she had two children. Vogel lived about 2 miles away from where her body was found. She was last seen alive 3 nights before her body was found. She had told her husband she was going to play bingo at a local Catholic church. She then drove off in her car, her body was found in. The police learned that Vogel never made it to bingo. In the car, the police found some shopping bags, so they suspected she went to a nearby shopping center before bingo. The police thought it was probably there that she encountered her killer. It's believed that Vogel was killed on the night she went missing. Her body was left in the parked car for 3 days. Vogel was naked. And her clothes were found under her body. They were neatly folded. Her wrists had been bound in front of her with a thin nylon rope. Vogel had been sexually assaulted, and then she was strangled and beaten to death. It's thought that the killer beat her with his fists. After about a week, the police considered the case cold. 10 years later, the case still had not been solved. It was mostly forgotten. On the night of December 15, 1977, the husband of 26-year-old X-ray technician Marianne was out of town on business. Her and her husband lived in an apartment building called Ledwidge Terrace, Little Ferry, New Jersey. That night, Carr was supposed to meet up with her mother-in-law, but she didn't show up. The next day, Carr's body was found beside a motel's parking lot in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey. She had died a horrific death. Handcuffs had been placed on her wrists, and her mouth was covered with duct tape. She had been struck in the face with a blunt object with some type of ligature. She also had a vicious bite mark on her left breast. The police interviewed Carr's neighbors, and one of them told the police something interesting. On the night of the murder, she saw Carr's husband in the parking lot, but the police were able to confirm that there was no way that Carr's husband could have killed her because he wasn't in town. It wasn't long before Carr's case went cold. The police had no idea that the murders of Carr and Vogel were connected. After all, they happened in different cities a decade apart. 9 months after Carr's murder, on September 23rd, 1973, a woman was found in a drainage ditch behind Ledwidge Terrace, which is the apartment building where Carr lived. The woman had been beaten and strangled, and there were bite marks on her breast. The woman was nearly dead. She was taken to the hospital. Doctors saved her life. The woman could not remember the night before too clearly. She had been at a bar in New York City,
drinking with a man.
She was drinking
who
with
said
a
his
man
name was John
who said his name
Schaefer.
was John Schaefer. She was sure she had been drugged. Testing was done. Having given a cocktail of two drugs. Since the woman couldn't remember much about the attack, the police did not think that they had many leads to follow up on. Less than 3 months later, the police in Hackensack, New Jersey were called to a motel. A sex worker had been drugged and beaten up. She also has several bite marks on her breasts. The woman told the police that the night before she went to a bar with a client who called himself Jim. Jim said he was a computer operator. He also said that he was married and he had 3 children. The woman said that she and Jim went back to the motel room. She said that after she had a sip of her drink, things got hazy. The next thing she knew, it was morning, and she was in a lot of pain. Once again, the police made little progress in solving the case. On December 2nd, 1980, firefighters were called to a motel in mid-Manhattan. A fire had broken out in one of the rooms. Inside the room, they found the dead bodies of 2 women. It was clear that they were dead before the fire was started. Their heads and hands were missing. The medical examiner noted that the 2 women had been tortured before they were killed. Their breasts had superficial cuts. Just over a month later, one of the women was identified. She was 22-year-old Didi Gudarzi. She was a sex worker and mother of 1. The other woman has never been identified. Their hands and their heads have never been found. On May 4th, 1980, a housekeeper working at a motel in Hasbrook Heights noticed an odd smell in the room that she was cleaning. She lifted the mattress, and under the bed was the dead body of a young woman. The body was later determined to be 19-year-old Valerie Ann Street. Street was a sex worker. The medical examiner thought that she had been tortured for hours before she was killed. Her wrist had handcuffs on them, and duct tape was wrapped around her head. Her breasts had noticeable bite marks on them. The cause of death was ligature strangulation. One investigator realized that Mary Ann Carr's body had been dumped beside the parking lot of the same motel 2.5 years earlier. A week later, on May 12th, a severely injured woman was found in a parking lot in Teaneck, New Jersey. The woman, who was a cocktail waitress, had been drugged and beaten. Her breasts had also been bitten. The woman survived the brutal assault. Just 10 days later, on May 15th, responded to a hotel fire in New York City. Inside a burnt-out room, the mutilated body of a woman was found. There were bite marks on her body. Her breasts had been removed. They were on the headboard. The police determined through fingerprints the body was 25-year-old Jean Rayner. Rayner was a sex worker who was known to work Times Square. The police in New York were sure that this killer was the same person who killed Didi Gudarzi and the Jane Doe 6 months earlier because of the similarities in the crime scenes. However, they had no idea who the killer was. Just a week later, on May 22nd, 1980, police were called to a motel in Hasbrook Heights. It was the same motel where Mary Ann Street's bodies were found. A guest had reported a woman screaming. The police went to the motel room, opened the door a crack. The officers could tell something was wrong, and they managed to get into the room. When they did, a man ran out the back door. They chased after him, and he was arrested. The woman, who was a sex worker, was taken to the hospital. She had been tortured for hours before she was found, but she ultimately survived her injuries. The man who was arrested was identified as 34-year-old Richard Cottingham. Cottingham was a computer operator at Greater New York. He was married. He had three children. Cottingham and his family lived in Lodi, New Jersey. After Cottingham was arrested, the police suspected that he might be responsible for the murders of Marianne Carr and Valerie Ann Street. Not only were their bodies found at the same motel, but they had all suffered bites to the breast. Also, Carr's neighbor was sure that she saw Carr's husband in the parking lot of their building on the night Carr was murdered. But that wasn't possible because Carr's husband was out of town on the night of the murder. It turned out Cottingham looked a lot like Carr's husband. Cottingham also had a connection to the apartment where Carr lived. The woman Cottingham was dating at the time of the murder later became his wife, lived in the same building as Carr. When Cottingham was questioned, he denied assaulting the woman in the motel room. He said that everything that went on was consensual. He also denied knowing Carr and he said he didn't kill them. The police got a search warrant for Cottingham's home. He had a private room in the basement that his family was forbidden from entering. Inside of it, the detectives found trophies that Cottingham had taken from his victims, like jewelry. The police in Bergen County, for all the New Jersey murders, and the New York Police Department worked together. The investigators concluded that Cottingham had killed Dee Dee Goudarzi, the Jane Doe, and Jean Rayner. Two of the women who had survived their attacks also picked Cottingham out of a lineup. Richard Cottingham was charged with a plethora of crimes. This included five counts of murder. Those were the murders of Marianne Carr, Dee Dee Goudarzi, the Jane Doe, Valerie Street, and Jean Rayner. In three different trials, Cottingham was convicted of all five murders. He was given three different sentences, 173 to 197 years to life, 75 years to life. When Cottingham was arrested, police did not connect him to 29-year-old Nancy Vogel in October 1967. Over the years, the police interviewed Cottingham in prison. In 2010, Cottingham confessed to the murder of Nancy Vogel. Cottingham, who was 21 years old at the time of the murder, said he encountered Vogel at the shopping center. In August 2010, Cottingham pleaded guilty to Vogel's murder, and he was given another life sentence. After that, the police continued to periodically visit Cottingham in prison. In 2019, Cottingham confessed to three more murders. On July 17, 1968, 13-year-old Jacqueline Hart was walking home from band practice in Midland Park, New Jersey. When she didn't make it home that evening, she was reported missing by her parents. The next day, Jacqueline's body was found in a wooded area just a few blocks from her home. She had been strangled to death with a leather strap that she was carrying. She had not been sexually assaulted. It appeared that her face was beaten after she was dead. On April 7th, 1969, 18-year-old Irene Blaze lived in Bagada, New Jersey, took a bus from Bagada to Hackensack. She was last seen talking to a man at the bus station in Hackensack. The next morning, her body was found about 3 miles from the bus station in the Saddle River, New Jersey. She was fully clothed. She had not been sexually assaulted. The cause of death was strangulation. Blaze wore a crucifix on a chain, and she was strangled with the chain. There were also some wounds on her face that appeared to be made post-mortem. It is thought that the killer punched her in the face after she had died. 3 months later, on the evening of July 14, 1969, 15-year-old Denise Velasquez left her family's home in Gloucester, New Jersey, on foot. She told her parents she was going to see some friends. It turned out that she had never intended to see her friends. What she was planning to do that night is unknown. The next day, her body was found near a cemetery in Saddle Brook. Her body was found just a few blocks from where Irene Blaze's body was found. Like Irene, Denise had been strangled to death with the chain of a crucifix that she wore. After she was dead, it appears that the killer struck her in the face several times. She was fully clothed. There were no signs of sexual assault. All three murders happened in Bergen County. At the time of the murders, Richard Cottingham was living in Little Ferry, which is in Bergen County. Jacqueline Hart was killed about 8 months after Cottingham killed Nancy Vogel. He would have been 21 years old when he killed Jacqueline. Although Richard Cottingham lived in the county where the murders took place, he wasn't seriously considered a suspect. That was because the murders that Cottingham committed later were so much more vicious and they involved torture. In early 2020, police announced that after months of investigating, they were confident that Richard Cottingham was the killer of the three young women, and they were closing their cases. What is odd is that Jacqueline Hart, Irene Blaze, and Denise Velasquez were not the only teenage girls to be killed in Bergen County in the late 1960s. It was believed that all the young women were murdered by a serial killer known as the Bergen Strangler. The first suspected victim of the Bergen Strangler was 18-year-old Alice Eberhard. At 2:30 p.m. on September 24th, 1965, Eberhard left the Hackensack Hospital where she was a student nurse. Eberhard lived with her parents in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. After Eberhard left the hospital, there was an intense thunderstorm in the area. Eberhard's father arrived home at about 5:30 p.m. that day. He found the house trashed. He then found the dead body of his daughter in one of the rooms. It appeared that Eberhard put up a fight, and that's why the house was trashed. She was nude from the waist down, but she had not been sexually assaulted. It's thought that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. She had also been stabbed 61 times. She was stabbed after she was dead. The two knives used to stab her came from the Eberhard's home. The police suspected that the killer knew Eberhard. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry, so it's quite possible that Eberhard let the killer into her home. The police also suspected that Eberhard knew, because she was only home alone for a few hours. This suggested that the killer knew her schedule. The murder of Alice Jean Eberhard happened nearly 2 years before Nancy Vogel was killed. Vogel is Cottingham's first confirmed victim. When Eberhard was killed, Cottingham was 19 years old, living in River Valley, which is in Bergen County. The next murder happened on April 4th, 1966, about 6 months after Eberhard was killed. 18-year-old Janet Ipso lived in Paramus, New Jersey. She was married on April 2nd, 1966. 2 days later, she was found brutally murdered in the apartment that she shared with her husband. She had been strangled to death with her hairnet. After she was dead, she was stabbed in the heart with a pair of scissors. She was nearly nude, but she had not been sexually assaulted. The last time she was seen alive was about 2 hours before her body was discovered. She had gone to a hardware store to buy cleaning supplies, and then she was seen walking home. Nearly 10 months later, on January 24th, 1967, 17-year-old Marianne Della Sala left her work and started walking home. Marianne lived in Hackensack. She didn't make it home. And she was reported missing. 80 days later, her semi-nude body was found floating in the Passac River in Hawthorne, New Jersey. She had not been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled to death and struck in the face. About 7 months later, Jacqueline Harp was strangled to death by the strangulation murder of Irene Blaze 9 months later. 3 months after that, Denise Velasca was killed by strangulation. People thought the one killer was responsible for all 6 murders because of the striking similarities between the cases. All 6 murders happened within 3 years and 9 months of each other. All the victims lived in, were killed in, and their bodies were found in Bergen County. All the victims were similar in age, ranging from 13 to 18. They were all petite, fair skin, or brownish red hair. All the victims, except for the first, was something that they were wearing, that they had in their possession. The first victim was stabbed with 2 knives that were found in her house. That meant the killer didn't carry a weapon with him. Also, many of the victims had been mutilated after death. Finally, the murder seemed to have a sexual element. None of the victims were sexually assaulted. Did Richard Cottingham kill Alice Jean Eberhard, Marianne Della Sala? If so, why did he not confess to the other 3 murders? Or were the first 3 murders committed by another serial killer? Or even 3 separate killers? One thing to note is that the first 3 murders, which Cottingham didn't confess to, happened before the murder of Nancy Vogel, his first confirmed victim. The 3 murders that he did confess to were committed after Vogel was killed. Richard Cottingham is also the prime suspect in several other murders. On August 9th, 1974, 17-year-old Marianne Pryor and 16-year-old Lorraine Kelly went to a mall at Paramus, New Jersey, which is in Bergen County. Their nude bodies were found in a wooded area in Montvale, New Jersey, 6 days after they went missing. They had been bound at the wrists and ankles. They were sexually assaulted and beaten. It's believed that they were strangled to death with a ligature. At the time of their murder, Richard Cottingham was 27 years old, and he was living in Little Ferry. The double homicide happened about 2.5 years before Marianne Carr was killed. Carr's murder was the first in a series of 5 murders which Cottingham was arrested and convicted of. One thing that the investigators noted was that Marianne Pryor and Lorraine Kelly's bodies were dumped in Montvale, which is a small borough in Bergen County. In the 1970s, Montvale had a population of around 7,000 people. It was the borough where Cottingham had dumped Nancy Vogel's body 7 years earlier. On January 13, 1979, the body of 19-year-old Helen
was found
Sykes
in a wooded
was
area
found in a wooded
near
area
LaGuardia
near LaGuardia
Airport
Airport
in Queens, New York.
Sykes was a sex
Sykes
worker
was a
who was
sex
known to hang
worker
out
who was
around
known to
Times
hang out
Square
around
looking
Times
for
Square looking
clients.
for clients.
She had been stabbed
She had been stabbed
and
multiple
her throat was
times,
slashed
and her
so
throat was
deeply
slashed so
that she was
deeply that she was nearly
decapitated.
decapitated.
Her legs had been removed.
Her legs had
and they
been
weren't
removed,
near her
and they weren't
body.
near her body.
They were found 3 days
They were
later
found 3
in
days
an alley
later
a few
in
blocks
an alley
away.
a few blocks away.
What is notable is that Sykes' body had bite marks on it. Sykes was killed about 11 months before Didi Godarzi and the Jane Doe were murdered in New York. Godarzi and Jane Doe were the second and third victims of the series of five murders that Cottingham was convicted of. Cottingham is still in prison serving those sentences. Even though the police consider the cases of Jacqueline Blaze, Irene Blaze, and Denise Velasca after Cottingham confessed to killing them, he has not been charged with their murders. Richard Cottingham, the torso killer and the Times Square Ripper, is currently incarcerated at the Trenton State Prison in Trenton, New Jersey. At the time of this video, he is 73 years old. Since being in prison, Cottingham has confessed to 4 murders. So it's believed that the police will continue to visit him in prison to see if he'll confess to any other murders. Number 3. Marilyn Monroe. In August 1980, the police in Weberville, Michigan received an unusual letter. It was from a 78-year-old woman who was living in a nursing home in Eaton Rapids, Michigan. The woman's identity has never been made public. She wrote that she had been living with a horrible secret for over 5 decades. Lately, because of the secret, she had been having horrible nightmares. She said that over 50 years earlier, her ex-husband, Russell Smith, killed a couple. She wrote that she thought that the couple's name was Monroe and they lived in Weberville. She also thought that the couple was well-to-do. The police in Weberville were not aware of a murder of that nature, so they passed the letter along to the state police. The state police did an investigation and they learned that in 1926, a couple with the last name Monroe was attacked at their farmhouse just outside of Fowlerville, Michigan. Fowlerville is about 5 miles from Weberville. 54-year-old Arthur Monroe lived on a farm with his 52-year-old wife, Marion. In early June 1926, they sold their farm for $17,000. Accounting for inflation, that was about $250,000. Even though they had sold the farm on June 10th, they were still living on the farm. On the morning of June 11th, a farmhand arrived and found Arthur on the ground between the house and the garage. He had been struck in the head multiple times. He was alive but unconscious. It appeared he had been attacked as he was carrying bags of groceries from his truck to the house. The farmhand went and got help. When he returned with his friend, they picked up Arthur and carried him to the master bedroom. That's when they made a horrifying discovery. 52-year-old Marion was in bed, and it was clear she was dead. Like her husband, she had been beaten in the head. Arthur was taken to the hospital, and a couple days later, he regained consciousness. At first, he didn't recognize his daughters or his brother. After some time, some of Arthur's memories came back to him, but he did not remember the night of the attack. Arthur lived for another 21 years, but he was never able to recall what happened that evening. The police theorized that the motive behind the attacks was robbery. They thought that the killer assumed that the $17,000 from the sale of the farm was in the house. but the money had been deposited in the bank shortly after the Monroes received it. So the killer only got $30 to $40 and the Monroes' watches. In 1980, after the state police figured out what crime the author of the letter was talking about, they talked to the author of the letter. She explained that at the time of the murder, she was living with her husband, Russell Smith, in a shack in the swamp, not far from the Monroes. Smith would have been 30 at the time of the murder. The woman said that Smith was a terrible husband. He refused to get a job, and he went out every night, usually with a different woman. On the night of the murder, he went out as usual. When he came home, he was very nervous, and he kept washing his hands. The woman assumed that Smith had killed the couple because that's what he told her. Apparently, Smith had assumed that he had killed Arthur, and he had not realized he was alive when he left the farm. The woman also said that at the time, they were poor, so she couldn't afford to buy a newspaper. She just believed whatever her husband told her, and for the past 5.5 decades, she assumed he had killed the couple. She also thought that someone else had been arrested and went to prison for the crime. The police did have 2 suspects, but no one was ever arrested for the crime. Russell Smith was not a suspect in the original investigation. The woman was asked why she took so long to go to the police about what her husband did. She said that Smith had threatened to kill her and their children. The woman said that they ended up getting divorced after 10 years of marriage. When the woman went to the police in 1980, it was too late to charge Russell Smith with any crimes. He had died 4 years earlier in Texas. After the woman came forward, the Michigan State Police felt confident closing the case after 54 years. Number 2. Susan Kilmer. Rhinebeck is a small village in New York's Hudson Valley. In the 1970s, the town had about 2,300 residents. In the summer of 1977, one of those residents was 14-year-old Susan Kilmer. She lived on Cedar Drive, which is a quiet street in the village. She lived with her parents, her brother, and her sister. Although Susan was 14, she liked to act like she was older. She smoked cigarettes, wore makeup, and hung out with kids who were older than her. On July 6, 1977, Susan and a friend hitchhiked to nearby Poughkeepsie. One of their friends was in the hospital, and they paid them a visit. Then they went to the main mall in downtown Poughkeepsie. Susan's friend needed to pick up a pair of glasses from an optometrist's office that was in the mall. But when they got to the office, they found out that the glasses were not yet ready. So at about 3:45 p.m., Susan and her friend split up. That evening, Susan didn't come home. Her parents were frantic, and at about 10 p.m., they reported her missing. The next morning, some kids were walking on a country road just outside of Rhinebeck. At the bottom of an embankment, they saw something odd. It turned out to be the body of 14-year-old Susan Kilmer. She was partially clad, and she had died from blunt force trauma to the head. She had been beaten to death with 2 rocks. Both blood-covered rocks were found near her body. Blood tests were done, and 2 different blood types were found on the rocks. One was type O, which was Susan's blood type. The other blood type was type A. The police concluded that the type A blood was the killer's blood. Although Susan was partially undressed, she had not been sexually assaulted. The police suspected that the killer had a vehicle and offered Susan a ride home, where he picked her up while she was hitchhiking.
Susan's family was shocked and deeply saddened by her brutal murder. Susan's parents suspected that Susan knew her killer. They did not think she would get into a car alone with a stranger. But Susan's siblings did not think that was true. They thought that Susan was bold and a bit adventurous. They thought she could have been hitchhiking home from the mall and then got into her killer's vehicle. A massive investigation was launched. In the 10 days after Susan's body was found, 18 investigators were working 14 hours a day on it. They interviewed over 400 people, but unfortunately, no arrests were made. It wasn't long before the case went cold. The murder was incredibly tough on the Kilmer family. Susan's parents ended up getting divorced. After 4 or 5 years, Susan's family assumed that the case would never be solved. They thought that the only chance it might be solved is if the killer committed a similar murder and he was arrested for that crime, and then the police connected the murders. The police had not lost hope that the case could be solved. In 1986, a state trooper named John Cordell sent the details of the murder to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and asked for assistance. The Behavioral Science Unit sent him a profile of the killer. The profile said that the killer probably had the emotional intelligence of someone in their teens or early 20s, but he was older. The killer probably drank alcohol before the murder. The killer's car was probably old and poorly maintained. The area where Susan was killed was probably familiar to him. He was unmarried and he lived with someone who he was financially dependent on. If he did have a job, it would be a menial job, and he probably didn't have much contact with the public. He was most likely introverted and had very little social skills. This would be especially true when dealing with females. He had probably been rejected by females in the past. He had possibly been rejected because he was overweight or had bad acne. Because of his failure with the opposite sex, he probably had low self-esteem. Since he had low self-esteem, he probably dressed slovenly and he didn't have a regular grooming routine. His education level was high school graduate or lower. He probably didn't have a criminal record, but if he did, the charges would be alcohol related, like driving under the influence. If he were questioned about the murder, he would cooperate. After getting the profile, several investigators on the case read it, but it did not lead to an immediate arrest. The next year, on September 25, 1987, the police were called to a home in Milan, New York. Milan is a town about 7 miles from Rhinebeck. They were called to the home by a 38-year-old man named Joseph Martin. Martin lived at the home with his parents. Joseph claimed that he went out to the grocery store, and when he came home, he found his 84-year-old father, Ralph Martin, dead in the backyard. Ralph had been shot once in the head with a shotgun. Joseph initially said that his father died by suicide, but the police investigating the crime scene said that the evidence didn't indicate that he had died by his own hand. When Joseph was confronted with this evidence, he changed his story. Joseph claimed that his father was a seriously ill man and he was in a lot of pain. Joseph said his father asked him to kill him to put him out of his misery. Joseph said he killed his father out of mercy. The police checked Ralph's health records and learned that the worst he was suffering from was arthritis in his left leg. Then a senior investigator with the state police named Thomas Selman was brought in to give Joseph a polygraph exam. Salmon had been one of the investigators on Susan Kilmer's case, and he read the FBI's profile on the killer. He immediately saw a lot of similarities between the profile from the Behavioral Science Unit and Joseph Martin. It turned out that before Salmon became a state trooper, he worked in construction. He had worked with Joseph on several jobs. Salmon knew that Joseph dressed slovenly and usually wore stained clothes. He often wore high tops without laces. His belly hung over his pants, and he shaved every so often. When he did shave, it was rushed, and something like his sideburns would be uneven. Joseph had never graduated from high school, and he only held menial jobs. He had never gotten married, and he lived with his parents. Joseph did have a few criminal charges, and they all happened when he was drunk. This included being arrested for drinking and driving. Another time, he made obscene gestures to a woman who was a neighbor of his parents. He was drunk when it happened. Joseph had also been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he spent time in a psychiatric hospital. Something else Salmon noted was that Joseph had type A blood, which was the killer's blood type. Also, not long after the murder of Susan, the police received a tip that Joseph committed the murder. Joseph was questioned by the state trooper, and the state trooper drove him by the crime scene. Joseph denied committing the murder, and he did not react when they drove by the crime scene. The state trooper also talked to his friends and family. One of them supplied Joseph with an alibi for the afternoon of the murder, so he was ruled out as a suspect. In November 1987, Joseph Martin was charged with the murder of his father, Ralph Martin. The district attorney said that Joseph killed his father to get his inheritance. The senior investigator who thought that Joseph killed Susan got in contact with another state trooper named Dennis McGuire. Over 10 years earlier, in July 1976, Joseph Martin was in a serious car accident. Joseph had been thrown from his vehicle, and when McGuire arrived at the crime scene, he found Joseph unconscious and he wasn't breathing. McGuire performed CPR on Joseph, and he ultimately saved his life. McGuire was also the state trooper who questioned Joseph after Susan's murder and drove him past the spot where she had been killed. First, Joseph was questioned about Susan's murder by a detective he didn't know. He was visibly shaken that he was being questioned about the murder. He denied having anything to do with Susan's murder. Then Dennis McGuire came in, and he asked for Joseph to tell the truth about what happened to Susan Kilmer. Joseph said he wanted to talk about the murder because it had been on his mind, and it felt like a pressure in his head. In July 1977, when Susan was killed, Joseph was 30 years old. He said that at about 3 p.m. on the day of the murder, he left his job at a pie factory and he picked up some beer at a local deli. He planned on driving to an area near the Hudson River to drink the beers. Along the way, he came across Susan. Joseph said that he already knew Susan. He claimed that they had met weeks earlier and they had sex. He said that Susan recognized his car and she waved him down. She got into his car and he started driving. He ended up in the area where her body was found and he got her into the back seat. He tried to undress her, but she rejected his advances. He became angry, so he started punching her and then he pushed her out of the car. He started beating her with one of the rocks and then he noticed he cut himself. This made him angry, so he got the bigger rock and he used it to finish Susan off. In February 1988, 10.5 years after Susan Kilmer's murder, Joseph Martin was charged with second-degree murder regarding her death. Since Joseph had a history of mental illness, he underwent several psychological examinations. In April 1988, he was deemed unfit to stand trial. But then, 3 weeks later, that decision was reversed and he was ordered to stand trial for all 3 murders. In October 1988, Joseph Martin pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter regarding the deaths of Susan Kilmer and his father, Ralph Martin. He was expected to be sentenced to 10.5 years to 31 years in prison. But then the judge postponed his sentencing trial indefinitely because he was deemed mentally unfit. It turned out that, besides schizophrenia, Joseph had dementia, possibly from his alcoholism. Joseph Martin was then placed in a state psychiatric hospital. In 1990, he was still considered too mentally ill to be sentenced, and he was to remain in the psychiatric hospital. Joseph Martin's current whereabouts are unknown. If he is alive, at the time of this video, he is 73 years old.
Number 1. Nancy Parker. Darrell Parker grew up in Iowa, and he attended the School of Forestry at the Iowa State University. During his second year, he went on a blind date with a young woman named Nancy Morrison. She was also attending the university, and she was a year behind him. They continued to date, and when Darrell was in his final year, he proposed. They were married in March 1954. In November 1954, Darrell moved to Lincoln, Nebraska because he got a job as a city forester. Nancy continued to go to school. Nancy finished her schooling in the spring of 1955, and then she joined her husband in Lincoln. A perk of Darrell's job was that they were given a house to live in. The house was in an isolated area in one of the city's parks. After moving to Lincoln, Nancy got a job as a dietitian at a local flour mill. She and another woman created recipes for the products that the mill sold. The recipes were then printed and attached to the products. Nancy was also hired to do a cooking show on the local television station. Darrell and Nancy felt incredibly fortunate for their good luck in life. They wondered if something terrible was going to happen to level everything out. On the night of November 13th, 1955, someone broke into their home. Not much had been stolen because the couple did not have much to steal. After the break-in, Darrell's boss had a team build a security fence around the house. A month later, on the night of December 13th, Darrell wrapped presents and Nancy wrote out Christmas cards. The next morning, Darrell left for work shortly after 7 a.m. He left Nancy home alone. She had planned on going to the post office to mail 2 packages and the Christmas cards later that morning. At lunchtime, Darrell went home. The documentary starts off with the discovery of a bloated, unidentified body floating in a river. He looked in the master bedroom and he saw Nancy lying in bed. She was under a quilt and a pillow was over her face. Darrell immediately sensed that something was wrong. He went to the bed and he removed the pillow. It was clear that his 22-year-old wife, Nancy, was dead. She had been beaten in the face. A length of twine and a length of clothesline rope were wrapped around her throat. She was nude under the quilt. Twine had also been used to bind her arms behind her back. Darrell immediately called the police and they arrived several minutes later. An autopsy was performed at the local hospital. 4 handkerchiefs had been stuffed in Nancy's mouth. She had a broken nose and a black eye. The cause of death was strangulation. Before she died, she had been raped.
The day after the murder, Daryl was asked to look around the house to see if anything was missing. The contents of Nancy's purse had been dumped out. Daryl thought that Nancy had $10 and that was missing. At the time, Daryl was on sedatives and he wasn't totally aware of his surroundings. It turned out that a suitcase that had been monogrammed with Nancy's initials was also missing. But Daryl didn't notice that the suitcase was missing. Instead, someone else who went through the house at a later date and knew Nancy owned the suitcase noticed that it was gone. The murder was big news in Lincoln. A witness reported seeing a dirty 1949 or 1950 black two-door Ford parked near the Parkers' home on the morning of the murder. The police learned that an ex-convict who lived in the area drove a car that matched the description. He was questioned and he took 2 polygraph exams. He passed the exams and he was eliminated as a suspect. A detective who worked on the case, who had been an FBI agent, had a feeling that the killer was Nancy's husband, Daryl. He pointed out that both the twine and the clothesline rope used to bind and kill Nancy and the 4 handkerchiefs that were stuffed in her mouth all belonged to the Parkers. Usually, killers bring their own weapons with them to the crime scene. After Nancy was buried, the police asked Daryl to come in for questioning, and he voluntarily came to the police station. The Lincoln police brought in a criminologist from Chicago, Illinois, named John Reed, to question Daryl. Reed was a former police officer and a polygraph expert. Reed had developed a reputation as someone who could get people to confess to crimes. Unlike many other interrogators of the time, Reed didn't brutalize the people he questioned. Instead, he used psychology to get people to confess. When Reed interviewed Daryl, he hooked him up to a polygraph machine. He then started asking Daryl questions about his wife's murder. No matter what the polygraph machine indicated, Reed told Daryl that he was lying. Reed then explained to Daryl what he thought happened. Reed said he thought that Daryl and Nancy had a bad marriage. He said that Nancy withheld sex from him but flirted with other men. Daryl simply snapped and then raped and killed his wife. Reed also told him that if he didn't confess, he'd fry in the electric chair. The interrogation lasted for 9 hours. Daryl eventually confessed and then signed the confession. On December 22, 1955, 8 days after Nancy was killed, Daryl was charged with first-degree murder. The next day, Daryl recanted his confession. Daryl claimed he was exhausted and emotionally drained, and Reed kept browbeating him. Daryl said that the way Reed questioned him made him feel like he was being hypnotized. Although Daryl recanted his confession, the damage was already done. In April 1956, Daryl went to trial for the murder of his wife. The only evidence against him was the confession. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to life in prison. The case helped launch John E. Reed's career as one of the foremost experts in interrogation. He eventually developed a method of interrogation called the Reed technique. It starts off with an interview to get a baseline read of a subject. During the interview, the interrogator asks the subject some non-threatening questions. Then the interrogator asks more loaded questions, like we're examining the evidence right now. Is there any reason your DNA might be on any of it? Based on this initial interview, the interrogator must determine if the subject is being truthful. According to the Reed technique, the best way to do this is through nonverbal cues. For example, does the subject appear to be anxious? Are they avoiding eye contact? Is one of their legs bouncing? If the interrogator determines that the subject is lying, they move on to the next phase, which is called the interrogation. The interrogator may leave the room for a few minutes and then come back in with something like a file folder. The initial phase involved a lot of questions, whereas the interrogation phase is more of a monologue by the interrogator. The interrogator may say, "We know you did this, and now we'll see what we can do about it." The interrogator shouldn't give the subject a chance to deny. Instead, the interrogator should give the subject alternatives, which allows them to save face, or minimize, or rationalize their role in the crime. If the subject does admit to something, then the interrogator should congratulate them for being honest and owning up to what they did. Then the interrogator works with the subject to create a full confession. The Reed Technique Manual was first published in 1962. Reed also established his own consulting firm, Johnny Reed and Associates Incorporated. In 1974, they started training law enforcement agencies. This includes police officers, ATF, FBI, and CIA agents, and members of the Secret Service, just to name a few. The Reed technique is still in use today by police forces around the world. As Daryl Parker sat in prison, he continued to proclaim his innocence. But then, in August 1969, over 13 years after he was convicted, his conviction was set aside because of an appeal. A judge ruled that Daryl's confession had been coerced. The judge ordered the state to give Daryl a new trial or release him. The district attorney planned on retrying him. In December 1969, Daryl was released from prison to await his new trial. In July 1970, a deal was made so that Daryl wouldn't have to go to trial again. Instead, he accepted a sentence of 25 to 45 years in prison. He would be paroled instead of going back to prison. After Daryl finished his parole, he moved to Moline, Illinois. He got a job as the superintendent of the parks, and he also got remarried. When people examined Daryl's case, even back in the 1960s, they saw a problem with the Reed technique, and that is, it can lead to false confessions. 30% of people who have been exonerated because of DNA evidence were convicted based on false confessions. In 2012, a Canadian judge said, stripped to its bare essentials, the Reed technique is a guilt-presumptive, confrontational, psychologically manipulative procedure whose purpose is to extract a confession. A significant problem is that the technique is based on determining if someone is being truthful or not. Over the past 3 decades, research has consistently shown that people, even veteran law enforcement agents, cannot determine who is lying. They are about as accurate as someone guessing the outcome of a coin flip. In fact, sometimes the police are worse at predicting when someone is lying than people in other lines of work because they feel more confident in their abilities. A major flaw in the Reed technique is that interrogators are told to look for nonverbal clues, like if the subject is acting anxious. But research has shown there is no correlation between anxiety and lying. Some people may just be anxious because they are being questioned by the police. Other times, someone will act calm, look a police officer in the eye, and tell a series of lies. Despite the criticism, Johnny Reed and Associates still train more interrogators than any other organization in the world. Johnny Reed died in 1982. He died before finding out what happened in the case that made him famous. The identity of Nancy Parker's killer would not be made public until December 1988, 33 years after her murder. On July 3, 1988, a 63-year-old death row inmate named Wesley Peary died of a heart attack. Peary was on death row for the June 1975 murder of a 51-year-old woman named Marianne Mitzner. Mitzner was bound and shot to death with a .22 caliber handgun when the coin shop she operated in Lincoln was robbed. Peary initially became a suspect because he had a lengthy criminal record. In fact, Wesley Peary had been an early suspect in the murder of Nancy Parker. He knew where the Parkers lived because he was part of the crew that built the security fence. He was also the ex-convict who drove the Ford that was questioned by the police before Darrell was arrested. He was ruled out as a suspect because he underwent 2 polygraph exams. But it turned out that before he took the polygraph exam, he took a tranquilizer which would have affected the results. Also, the 2 officers who gave him the polygraph exam were not experts at polygraph exams. Sometime after Nancy's murder, Peary was convicted of rape and he was imprisoned at the Nebraska State Prison. His fellow inmate was Darrell Parker. Supposedly, Peary told Darrell that if he paid him, he would reveal who killed his wife. Peary also said he would reveal the location of the stolen suitcase. When Darrell initially looked around the house after the murder, he didn't realize that the suitcase had been stolen. But it was later confirmed that the suitcase had gone missing around the time of the murder. While Peary was on death row for the murder of Marianne Mitzner, he met with 2 lawyers on 3 different occasions. Once in 1978, another time in 1979, and then again in 1980. During the meetings, Peary said that in addition to killing Mitzner, he killed 12 people in 6 different states. He told the lawyers that they could not reveal the details of his confessions until after his death. Since they were bound by client attorney privilege, they couldn't tell anyone about the confession until Peary died. One of the murders that Peary confessed to was the murder of Nancy Parker. Peary was able to draw the layout of the house, including where the furniture was located. He was also able to describe a birthmark that Nancy had on her chest. Finally, he said he stole Nancy's watch and he pawned it. The fact that Nancy's watch was stolen had never been made public. Another one of the 12 murders that Peary confessed to happened in April 1954 while Peary was in prison serving a burglary charge. He and another inmate attacked a 7-year-old prison guard, John M. Clausen, in the prison's printing plant. Clausen was struck on the head with the leg of a chair, and then his throat was slit with a pocket knife that he carried. The other murders that Peary confessed to could not be verified, and it's believed he lied about them. In 1988, after Wesley Peary's confessions were made public, it closed a cold case that not many people realized was cold. Of course, Darrell Parker and the people who didn't believe he killed Nancy knew that the case was cold. In 1991, Darrell was granted a full pardon. 20 years later, Darrell's lawyer filed a claim asking for $500,000 for the 13.5 years Darrell spent in prison. A year later, in August 2012, the Attorney General of Nebraska apologized to Darrell. Darrell was also granted a declaration of innocence and he was awarded $500,000.